Israel has taken this one unusually seriously. They appointed an internal military prosecutor to investigate what happened. And the official line is they were after a Hamas target, but were not expecting any civilian casualties. And the latest, as of a couple of hours ago, is that the investigation is saying that a very, very small ordnance was used, but seems to have caught fire to some kind of fuel store that was in the place. And that is what caused the fire. And looking at the videos and the pictures of the space, there's no crater or any impact that suggests that there was a large bomb used. That is, I'm not saying it's true, but it's at least plausible.
Palestinians sifted through smoking wreckage in Rafah on Monday as others mourned the dead. Hours after an Israeli airstrike triggered a massive blaze in a tent camp where displaced people were taking shelter. Dozens were killed, according to Palestinian officials in Hamas-run Gaza, who said the toll was likely to rise. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Parliament the strike was not intended to kill civilians.
In
Rafah, we already evacuated about 1 million non-combatant residents, and despite our utmost effort not to harm non-combatants, something unfortunately went tragically wrong. We are investigating the incident and will reach conclusions because this is our policy.
Now it's 5 minutes past 6. The United Nations Security Council will hold an emergency meeting today to discuss the Israeli strike on a tent camp in Rafah. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said it was a tragic mistake, but has vowed to continue the war in Gaza. Areih Kovler is a journalist and political analyst in Jerusalem and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, as I was saying there, Benjamin Netanyahu says this was a tragic mistake. I mean, is that the response you expected from Israel to what has happened?
Look, throughout this war, which has now been something like 8 months, there have been a number of incidents in which there have been civilian casualties. And Israel's response has been different, from sometimes saying it wasn't us, to saying there was an important Hamas target there, to sometimes saying we didn't expect this to happen. That seems to be the response in this case. And I have to say, in this one, unusually seriously. They appointed an internal military prosecutor to investigate what happened. And the official line is they were after a Hamas target, but were not expecting any civilian casualties. And the latest, as of a couple of hours ago, is that the investigation is saying that a very, very small ordnance was used, but seems to have caught fire to some kind of fuel store that was in the place. And that is what caused the fire. And looking at the videos and the pictures of the space, there's no crater or any impact that suggests that there was a large bomb used. That is, I'm not saying it's true, but it's at least plausible.
Yeah. Even if that were the case, though, it would still be a huge risk for a military intervention in a place like that, where there are so many people sheltering in such a small area. I mean, the international community is obviously responding to this. Do you expect that it will change Israel's approach in any way at all?
I actually think that it may. Remember that this Rafah operation was sort of on the cards for months and months, with Israel saying it was going to go in heavily, and the US in particular, backed up by the UK and other countries, saying don't do that, it will be a disaster, thousands of deaths. The Rafah operation has begun, but it doesn't look like the operation that everyone was afraid of so far. So far, obviously, there have been civilian casualties and tragedies like this one, but there hasn't been this kind of widespread Rafah invasion that people were worried about. And I think that the events 2 or 3 days ago now are just going to solidify that, are going to try and impose a certain level of caution. It does seem like the US in particular is pretty furious that this happened, and there'll be a bit more caution. But ultimately, this is a war, and unfortunately, people are trying to kill each other on both sides, and tragedies happen.
And how close are we to resolving that war, as you were talking about there? I mean, there have been a number of different talks over the last couple of months now. Where are we at in that particular process?
Well, here we go again. There's yet another round of ceasefire talks beginning this week. But the problem is that the two sides are pretty much talking past each other. The Qataris, the Egyptians, the Americans are acting as mediators, but they never manage to get the two sides into the same place. And every time it seems like there's a concrete proposal, it tends to be well outside what the other side can accept. Hamas ultimately It does not want any kind of a deal that results in them not being in power at the end. What they want is a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and what Israelis would call a surrender in the war, an Israeli unilateral surrender. Israel obviously does not want that and wants to remove Hamas from power. It's hard to see how those two sides could ever agree on anything that looks like a resolution that doesn't completely breach one of their fundamental red lines. So, all that said, it doesn't seem like there's a military solution to this war coming up in the next couple of weeks either. Israeli sources talking about this going on for months or even years. Hamas talking in similar terms. Unfortunately, this could be with us a long time.
And you mentioned America in reference to how some of the international calls have maybe curbed Israel's actions, at least in some way. I mean, thinking about that peace process and the potential for a two-state solution, how entwined is America in those talks, and how likely is it that the Americans are going to be able to find a way through for both sides here?
Well, we're talking about two slightly different things here. One is the talks between Israel and Hamas over Gaza and this war. And then the bigger question about Israel and Palestine, meaning the Palestinian Authority here, who do not control Gaza, only the West Bank, over a possible Israel-Palestinian solution. The US is very involved in both of those tracks, but they're separate tracks. One of those tracks right now involves, like you said, the Qataris and the Egyptians. That's the Gaza-Hamas track. And the bigger picture Israel-Palestine track involves the Saudis and the Emiratis. And there was a pretty bold offer put by the Saudis, essentially full recognition of Israel by Saudi Arabia and many other Arab countries in return for a two-state solution. Netanyahu said not interested. And honestly, most Israelis, after the events of October the 7th, and in a situation where Hamas still controls Gaza, don't really understand what it would mean to make peace with a Palestine when half of Palestine is still controlled by Hamas. So, I think all of those bigger questions about a two-state solution and a peace process will have to wait until there's a different government in all of Palestine and also a different government in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me to my final question, which is that how is Benjamin Netanyahu's support in Israel at the moment? I mean, we know that there have been protests, there have been some real deep concerns about the future of those hostages, about his own strategy, about what exactly he is pursuing here. Where does he stand now at the moment politically?
So, normally after something like a war, Prime Minister's popularity might surge, rally around the flag effect. That did not happen to Netanyahu at all. And it kind of cratered. In fact, he's beginning to build back a little bit more support, particularly in the face of things like the International Criminal Court warrants, which, do kind of make Israelis feel everyone's against us. We have to stand up for our leaders. That said, he's still underwater in the polls heavily. And Benny Gantz, who joined the government in an emergency to support the emergency government, is saying he's going to leave in a week or two because the government is not coming up with any kind of a strategy. Supposedly, he's no longer talking to his own defense minister. That said, he still has the votes right now in the Knesset to keep his government in office. But if that were ever to change, it's very unclear that he'd be re-elected. And that's precisely why he feels the need to cater to every member of his coalition, particularly those on the far right, because he knows that if there's an electoral test, he'll probably lose it.
Areih Kovler, journalist and political analyst in Jerusalem, thank you for joining us this morning.